Hey, good evening everyone and welcome to an Aussie Cyclone Chasers Cyclone video update. Tonight, the 14th of March 2014, and the big news tonight, or this evening, is that Tropical Cyclone Gillian is back. And Gillian is moving in a north, or has been moving in a northeasterly direction. Look, the centre was repositioned last night. Remember how in last night's video we talked about it eventually getting too close to land, and we said that the only way this thing could possibly develop into a cyclone was if it tracked northeast. Well, guess what happened? It decided it was going to track northeast. Now, the centre was repositioned under the deep convection that we see on satellite, and we'll show you that deep convection shortly, but the system was renamed this afternoon around 4 o'clock in Northern Territory time, and we see the system is expected to now push to the northwest and then west-northwest in the longer term. There's still a fair error margin here of around about 6 or so hundred kilometres between the southernmost outliers, which have it near Darwin, and the northernmost outliers, which have it well north in the Arafura Sea. However, should the system adopt the track that the Bureau of Meteorology expected to adopt, if you're to the east of that track, you're going to see a lot of rainfall as the system passes nearby. Now, it's expected to get pretty close to Gove and Elcho Island as a Category 1 tropical cyclone. It is not expected to deepen too much more than it has done so already once it starts to push to the west because, and we'll go through that shortly, there's going to be a fair bit of dry air that gets entrained into the circulation. Now, look, we talked about this a lot last night, so I'm only going to touch on it again tonight. If you want to know more details about that dry air, have a look at last night's video, because everything that was said last night is still valid for tonight as well. Obviously, the only difference is that the system has moved northeast and has now intensified because of that to a Cat 1 cyclone. So if we take a look at this system over the past 24 hours, we can see that it's basically trended to the northeast here on a satellite, and we can see that the satellite signature is improving from the system, although it has just waned in the last couple of frames. But overall, over the past 24 hours, you can definitely see an intensification there of the system as it tracks to the northeast. Now, from here, it is expected to push back to the northwest and then west-northwest from there indefinitely for a long period of time, in fact. Now, the track forecast intensities, again, range from about a Category 2 to a tropical low. There's some models that are very disinterested in the system, and there's some models that are quite interested in the system as it tracks across the Northern Territory coastline. Now, the ones that are more interested in the system do drift it a lot more to the north. The ones that are less interested in the system drift it to the very close to the coastline, and so the interaction between the system and the coastline will limit its potential intensity. Once again, though, if you are looking for rainfall from the system, obviously the favoured outcome would be that it tracks either over land or right along the coastal strip, because that will dump a lot of rain, especially once the system is to the west of that particular landmass area. You can see in the latest satellite imagery we've got some really dense cloud here, some really good strong thunderstorm activity just to the east of the tropical cyclone centre. The centre lies on the western edge of that cloud mass, and once again will push to the northwest from there. If we look at the latest satellite-derived wind estimates here, we've got winds of up to 25 to 30 knots on the northwestern quadrant of the system here. You can see located well to the, or not well to the northwest, but pretty well entirely on the northwestern quadrant. There's no real gale force winds to the southeast and or the south or the southern quadrant. So really, folks, it is a very lopsided tropical cyclone at this point in time. Look, according to the satellite-derived wind estimates, at 4 p.m. today, it wasn't a cyclone, but these are only best guess estimates. That's something to consider when we're looking at these. They are only best guess estimates, so they can be a little bit off. And the Bureau of Meteorology believe that this is now a tropical cyclone, so they have renamed it. So the latest track ensemble from the GEFS, so the GFS ensemble, we can see that the system from here is expected to track north and then west-northwest from there, and lying just to the north of the Territory coastline, remaining a fairly weak system throughout its entire life cycle as it tracks to the west-northwest here. And overall, you can see very good model agreement from the GFS model and its ensemble members. Pretty similar agreement from the latest we have from the European model as well, but this is now 12 hours old, or sorry, 18 hours old almost, so we can see that the system didn't initialize really well the expected movement patterns, so basically throw this first bit out the window. But overall, we can see the final track over the next 5 days is quite similar on the Euro model as well, ranging from a track as far south as Darwin to as far north as the central Arafura Sea. So here's the future track of Tropical Cyclone Gillian from the CMC model. We can see that the system basically tracks west in the CMC model and then over the top of the rough terrain of Timor and Indonesia. And that is where the system is located by the 20th of January. So really continuing west and then continuing west even in the longer term than that as well. There is very, very little chance once again of any sort of impact on the Pilbara or Kimberley coastline of WA, even in the extremely longer term. You can see on the UK Met guidance also we have that the system now lies in the central Gulf of Carpentaria. From here it pushes to the northwest and basically gets very close to the coast of Nullumbai or Gove and then continues in a west-northwest direction into the Arafura Sea and then into East Timor by the 19th of March. Even the US Navy's computer model, which isn't that great, is suggesting a very similar track here from Tropical Cyclone Gillian, pushing in a west-northwest or northwest direction and then off the Northern Territory coastline pushing west and into Timor. The high-resolution experimental FIM9 model does suggest a very similar track again, pushing in a north and then a westerly direction or a sharp curve to the west here around about the area of Gove, Elcho Island, continuing west across the Tiwi Islands and then pushing west into the Timor Sea. And then indefinitely in the longer term, the FIM model wants to keep this system pushing well west out here into the Southeast Indian Ocean. And it should come as no surprise at all that the European is doing almost exactly the same as that. And so it pushing it in a northerly direction and then basically due west out here into the Southeast Indian Ocean. Look, folks, there is very little track variability in this system. Once it gets off the Northern Territory coast, there is very little track disagreement in terms of where it's going to go in the longer term. It's not making a visit to the Pilbara or the Kimberley. There is something out here, and I'll show it to you very shortly, that is going to stop that from happening. So overall, the system will track west indefinitely. It will probably eventually make a recurve, maybe in about 7 to 10 days' time, but by the time it does that, it's way out here in the almost the central Indian Ocean. If we look at a bit of a high resolution examination of the European model, we can see that the Euro is overall underestimating the initial intensity of this tropical cyclone. Much like the satellite-derived wind estimates, the Euro is also suggesting that the maximum winds around this system are about 20 to 25 knots, so that's opposite to what the Bureau is suggesting of 30 to 35 knots. So we do have to caution when looking at this model that it has already underestimated it. In terms of the GFS model at around about the same time, we can see the GFS probably has a better grip on the estimated intensity of the system here, developing gales around the system tonight. So we might actually take a closer look at the GFS model rather than the Euro tonight. It just seems to have a better handle on Tropical Cyclone Gillian. As we head towards 24 hours, we can see that the system tracks in a due north direction almost. As we head to 36 hours, it starts to track to the west. Now, it also doesn't intensify any more than it has done already, and if we look at the amount of moisture in the atmosphere at the time, we can see this really dry air pushing up through the Northern Territory, almost like the start of the dry season for the Northern Territory in terms of that dry air just pushing so far to the north, right along the top end coast. And some of that dry air is even starting to push through north of the system as well, which means the system is fighting a bit of a losing battle there if it's trying to intensify. The other thing we look for at the time is wind shear, and we should see that wind shear overall is quite good. There is a little bit of moderate shear to the north of the system and a little bit of moderate shear to the south, but overall the system lies in sort of weak to moderate vertical wind shear, which isn't too bad if it's already going. If it's trying to get going and it's under that sort of shear, it's going to struggle. But at this point in time, based on that projection at Saturday night, we should see the system located just off the coast of Gove. And if we continue to push through the model run through to Sunday morning, we see that the system basically right around that Gove to Elcho Island area. As we head to Sunday night, we actually see a mild intensification of the system on the Sunday according to the GFS, so it finds a little bit of a pocket of decent conditions there on the Sunday and intensifies the system slightly, and then it basically just pushes due west the whole time. So if we continue watching the system through to Sunday and then into Monday, it pushes the system directly to the west over the top of the Coburg Peninsula, producing some gale force winds in and around the Darwin Harbour region. And really, the GFS does tend to overestimate these things, though, so just do bear that in mind when looking at this model projection. So if I compare that to the EC model, and the reason, once again, I didn't show you the EC model to start with was because the European model has slightly underestimated this system. But overall, if we look at the Euro track for Sunday morning at 10 a.m, we see that the system, much weaker, is located over the top of Elcho Island. Same sort of area, though. You know, like the actual track difference is very minimal, even if we look at the different model guidance. The only thing that's different here is the intensity of the system. This is a very weak low, as opposed to the GFS, which has a much stronger cyclone, category 1 or 2 cyclone in its intensity estimates. So if we look at 72 hours as we head to Monday, the system lies north of the Coburg, so I guess that's another difference there in the track in 3 days' time. The EC model keeps it a little bit further to the north, the GFS model a lot closer to Darwin itself, and a lot further back to the east. So there's, I mean, if it becomes a stronger system, there's a chance there that it'll track a little slower and it'll track a little further south. If it's a weak system, chances are it'll be a little bit further to the north and a little bit faster moving. You can see overall on Monday, as the system approaches the Coburg or Darwin region, we actually see that dry air still remaining not too far to the south of the system. The system is lying in a very marginal area for development. It's not overly bad, folks. So if the system is actually going, so if it's a tropical cyclone at this point in time, there's a fair chance that it will remain a tropical cyclone as long as it's not on the coast. The conditions out here do not warrant rapid weakening of the system. But if the system is too close to land, is a weak low, then we're not expecting the system to intensify at all. So the conditions, as I say, are marginal for this tropical low or tropical cyclone. If it keeps its identity as a cyclone, we're not expecting it to weaken. But if it can't maintain that, or if it can't get that identity to start with out here, then obviously we don't expect it to become one while it's up here. At this point in time anyway, that's what the guidance shows us. So not overly bad, but not exactly good either. So why is it pushing in a westerly direction, and why is it going to continue pushing in a westerly direction? Well, the answer is pretty simple. It's located over the top or the northern edge of a high pressure ridge in the mid-levels of the atmosphere. That high pressure ridge will keep it moving pretty well due west, maybe west-southwest, and it'll keep it moving that way for an extended period of time. See, normally, climatologically, what happens is they move west to about here, then they start moving south, and then they bang into the Pilbara coast. Not expected to happen with this one. This one's just expected to continue pushing west and west and west and west, all the way out, and by the time it starts to push back to the south, it's way too far to the west of Western Australia to pose any sort of risk, any sort of problem. There is still that very, very outlying model that does suggest possibly Exmouth could be close, or Coral Bay on the recurve, but folks, that's a very, very large outlier. Most of them have this pushing so far to the west that Western Australia won't see a mill of rain out of this. If we take a zoomed out approach, and now we're going to start talking about ex-tropical cyclone Hadi, because this upper high is just so big, it is just such a large upper high. See, it goes from here all the way through to the South Pacific. Anything that lies in the northern half of this upper high is going to push in a westerly direction. That includes anything from Fiji, and that's why ex-tropical cyclone Hadi is coming back. So, Hadi is currently located out here in between Vanuatu and Fiji. Hadi is about to have the skids put on him, and he's going to stop pushing in a easterly direction. He's going to stay fairly stationary here for a couple of days, and probably up to 2 days, and then push west over Vanuatu again and push directly west towards Australia, back into the Coral Sea. Now, some model guidance has this developing into a tropical cyclone. The reputable model guidance has this keeping and maintaining a low pressure system rather than a tropical cyclone. Look, the best case scenario for Queensland rainfall is a low pressure system that hits somewhere over northern or far northern Queensland, because a low pressure system that hits over north or far northern Queensland, along with a fairly strong high, is going to create these beautiful east to northeasterly winds along the coastline. These feeder bands coming in from the Coral Sea. It's going to create widespread rainfall from southeast Queensland all the way through to the far north. So this could be a major rain producer in particular for all of Queensland's east coast, anywhere south of the system, especially if it's currently what guidance suggesting that it's going to lie to the north of a very strong high pressure system between or around about the New Zealand region in 5 to 8 days time. So this could be a big rain producer late next week and into the weekend. So fingers crossed it remains a low. If it tightens up into a tropical cyclone, we're probably going to see a more centralized area of rainfall. The rainfall is going to be heavier, but it's over a more central area. So anyway, that is the FIM model guidance over the next 5 days. So this is by day 5. We expect it to lie basically east of Cooktown. The grey value that you see here are rainfalls of around 50 millimetres or more over 24 hours. So this grey area is really beneficial, especially now after day 5 it starts to push onto the actual coastline, which is fantastic. Same thing with the Euro model. The Euro model puts the skids on as well, and boom, the system just stops out here, stops dead, and then starts to push back to the west, remaining a very weak tropical low. But remember, we don't care. Even if it is a weak tropical low and it hits the coast as a tropical low, we're still going to get that beautiful east to northeasterly feed onto the coast. We're going to see good rainfall Harvey Bay northwards, really. So we don't care if it's a tropical low and whether it's a tropical low or cyclone at that stage. But the Euro and the UK Met suggesting similar scenarios with a tropical low approaching and eventually possibly hitting the far north Queensland coastline. So here's the UK Met. The UK Met skids on, bang, and back to the west. And the UK Met, though, keeps it a little bit too far to the north. So if it stays this far north and right on the sort of base of PNG, tip of Cape York, well, then we have very limited rainfall chances further to the south. Further south than, say, around about the Townsville area would be about as far south as you're going to see decent rain. You can see here, if we have a look at the UK Met model, you can see this feeder band coming in from Fiji, but really not getting much further south than Cairns, even as the system tracks to the west. So we don't want the system to be that far north. We hope that the system crosses around Cooktown to Cairns for maximum rainfall impact along most of the Queensland coast. That would be the ideal situation, ideal scenario. The Navy model also, bang, straight there, skids on and straight back out to the west, remaining a tropical low, and by day 5 remaining a tropical low well off the Queensland coast. So it has a much slower moving system to the west. The Canadian CMC model, also a little bit slower in its movement to the west, but really has the system tracking directly east of Cooktown here at about 155 east. Once again, folks, this is once again an ideal situation. If the system continues pushing west or even west-southwest from there, the system will track and will get a very nice pressure gradient force here, or squeeze between a high located near New Zealand and the tropical low or cyclone as it crosses the Queensland coast. Would be fantastic news for some rainfall across eastern Queensland. Is by day 4 we just have one massive upper ridge, and it starts way out here in the South Pacific and goes all the way out here through to Central Australia. It's the same ridge that's taking Gillian way out west of Western Australia. Is the same ridge that's going to be taking Cyclone Hadi and pushing him back towards the Queensland coastline. So, as I say, it's very unusual for us to tell you that there is very little variability in this track guidance, especially for the Coral Sea. The Coral Sea is almost never this easy to predict, yet this is certainly one of those cases where we're very confident on this movement pattern. And the GFS model too is very, very confident on that ridge holding and building all the way out to the South Pacific and pushing all the way through, and that will maintain, even in the GFS model, a westerly movement of the system throughout the entire life cycle of the system over the next 5 or so days, all the way west towards the Queensland coast. Now, as I say, we do have some variability in the track guidance. The GFS model, for instance, does develop this into a weak tropical cyclone, getting into a moderate tropical cyclone, possibly even a Category 2. But once again, all the winds packing to the south of the system, all the way through to landfall here around the Cooktown to Princess Charlotte Bay or Cape Melville area. The European, on the other hand, is being much more subdued, as the European is. It tends to be a little bit too a little bit too subdued in most cases, especially a little bit further out in the forecast period. But it tends to be the calming influence compared to the GFS, which gets everyone excited. The European brings everyone down. Somewhere in the middle is what actually normally happens. So we can see here a very, very weak circulation on the European, and almost washes out into basically a trough system as it approaches the far northern peninsula coastline. Now, once again, the good news for that is obviously we're not so much worried about at this point in time, we're not so much worried about the intensity of the system. We're just worried, and not so much worried, but very interested to see where this rainfall lies. And you can see there's Brisbane there. You can see that as the system tracks to the west, and as it tracks as a trough system, we actually see some pretty decent rain all along the Queensland coastline there as we get towards Thursday and Friday next week. So we can see some pretty decent rain along the Queensland coast, light to moderate falls everywhere, some moderate to heavy falls in parts that tend to be under the feeder bands here over the North Tropical and Herbert and Lower Burdick and Central Coast with Sundays. And even further south we get a much more moist easterly flow even towards the Brisbane region. So folks, that's very positive news for places that haven't seen any rain on that coastline south of about Mackay, that have been very, very devoid of rain over the past couple of months. There is a good chance there, if this low, or should this low push to the west and remain a low, that we will get some pretty decent rain along the Queensland coast later on next week. Same sort of thing on the GFS. This develops it into a cyclone. So we look at Wednesday night and Thursday morning. We can see that overall the GFS also has some fairly decent rain anywhere from the Hervey Bay coast northwards all the way through to landfalling of the system. So we can see though the feeder band coming in, because it is a cyclone in the GFS model. We see a much stronger feeder band coming right over the Central Coast and with Sundays, as well as some much stronger rainfall right in the vicinity of the system here. But we still see that general light to moderate rainfall all along the Queensland coastline, anywhere from the coastal landfall point southwards, even as far south as the sunny coast. So the question might be asked, what the hell is stopping this from developing? And if we have a look at the system there on Wednesday morning, located in the northern Coral Sea, and we look at wind shear values, you'd be mistaken to thinking that the system is actually going to bomb out, because look at this, no shear whatsoever. But let's have a look at the amount of moisture. We see some dreadfully dry air in the Coral Sea, some very dry, almost dry season type conditions in the Coral Sea, which are going to limit the potential for this thing to develop storms and maintain its storms for any length of time around the centre. So you can see here, here's the circulation, here's this dry air right around the circulation. It's not even attached to this moist tongue of air coming westwards across the South Pacific. It's really detached from that. There's no real monsoon feeding it, and so because of that, it's on its own there, and that's, I guess, a key difference between the Euro and the GFS. The GFS shows that dreadfully dry air as well, but it does have the system attached at least to a moist tongue of air coming across from the southwest Pacific. And once again, if we look at the GFS in terms of wind shear values on the GFS fairly low as well, getting up to about moderate levels, but overall quite favourable in the Coral Sea. So look, folks, shear values are not an issue. It's more so the lack of available moisture in the mid-levels of the atmosphere that is the biggest issue that this system will face. So the storms that it develops will not be able to sustain themselves for any length of time, and that's why the system does not show any deepening in a lot of the model guidance as it pushes towards Queensland. So the next 4 days of rain, well, Gillian's going to cause a fair bit of rain over the top end coast, but it's going to be very coastal because the system's track is going to keep it pushing to the west, right along that coast, or just to the north of that coast. Once you're east of the system centre, you're going to get these northeasterly winds coming in, and they're going to drag in a lot of moisture from the Arafura Sea, and so you will get a fair bit of rain on that coast, particularly once the system is to the west of you. So once again, these next 4 days, you're going to see some fairly heavy rain there, fairly dry over most of Queensland, and fairly dry over WA, although there is going to be a continuation of some isolated showers and storms all across the Pilbara and Kimberley over the next 4 days. The 4 days after that, we're going to see that Coral Sea business coming towards the west, and we're going to start to see some pretty decent rainfall along the Queensland coast, particularly on days 6, 7 and 8. of this forecast. We're going to see some pretty nice moist easterly winds pushing onto the coast, and then obviously if the low has some intensity about it, you might actually see some purple in here rather than blue. So you might see falls of 100 to 200 millimeters, maybe even more if the system remains a little bit stronger than most models suggest. The Gillian will continue moving west and will have no impact on WA whatsoever once it does so, and really even in the long term will have no impact on WA from most of the guidance that we've seen, all of the guidance that we've seen in fact. There might be some shower and storm activity continuing here over the Pilbara and Gascoyne region and inland parts of Western Australia. That rain over coastal Queensland not expected to push too far to the west either. Alright folks, that's it for tonight. We'll have another update on Gillian and what Ex Hadi is doing tomorrow. As I say, Ex Hadi is going to put the skids on tonight and over tomorrow, and then from about Sunday onwards it'll start to push back towards Queensland. Gillian will continue to push in, or will start to push in a northwest direction, then west direction, and then will continue pushing in a westerly direction over the foreseeable future. Thanks for watching. We'll have another update tomorrow night. Good night.